It was December 1984. M.R. Zigler had 10 months left of a lifetime that would span nearly 94 years. Even at that age, it was difficult for him to sit still. There were dreams he yet wanted to fulfill, issues that needed addressing, and of course people he wanted to talk to. But that day, M.R. sat still and talked about his life.
I keep my objectives for the future. I don't give much time to the past, even though I like to review it and see the road over which you come. But the future is still beautiful. A world without war, without killing.
A world without killing was the lifetime goal of M.R. Zigler. His commitment to peace shaped his entire life, and his life in turn shaped a generation.
He spoke at our annual conference in Kassel, Germany, for the annual conference for all European workers. And I just remember being so inspired and motivated. I don't remember a word he said, but I remember the inspiration and the motivation that he was able to engender.
He was so full of enthusiasm that he could almost just set you on fire with ambition.
He couldn't just sit still, just couldn't sit still. Keep trying the goal, his goal was peace and the church. He just had a one-track mind.
He was like Jeremiah, he had a fire burning in his belly and he just couldn't put it out.
M.R. Zigler was really the representative Brethren person for the 20th century. That is, if I have to pick one person who really incorporates Brethren values, it would have to be him.
The church got a great new vision of what it was and what it could do because of M.R. Zigler. He was a great visionary, but what he dreamed, he could bring it into fruition.
The feeling in the family was that he was a little too religious, a little too radical, but that really deep down, he was probably right.
I felt he's a real close friend, and then discover everybody else considers him a close friend too. He was just able to communicate that.
M.R. Zigler was born in this home in Broadway, Virginia, a building so steeped in history that it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. For many years, it was used as the meeting house of the Linville Creek Church of the Brethren congregation into which M.R. was born. It was constructed with walls that could be folded up to make room for the church gatherings. M.R.'s church, with its historic commitment to pacifism and nonviolence, was his guiding influence, and M.R. had a role model virtually in his own backyard. The neighboring property was the home of martyred Brethren elder John Klein, who during the Civil War rode his horse across the north-south line frequently to moderate the church's annual conference and to minister to the sick. Klein's refusal to take up arms on either side led to his being murdered. A monument on this hilltop marks the spot where he was ambushed by renegade rebel militiamen.
That was my living experience. It's not out of books, wasn't from preaching so much, but just living with that life. Then, of course, that life, John Klein's life, became an image in the Church of the Brethren, and I peddled that. I preached it, I quoted it, and it kept me alive. I would, of course, I promised when I was baptized then that I wouldn't go to war. And I joined the church when I was 13. And so I've had that conviction all the way, plus the John Klein life. So that I had a living example and a Bible and a church.
M.R. nurtured and strengthened those beliefs at Bridgewater College, operated by the Church of the Brethren, and later as a theological student at Vanderbilt University. When World War I came, M.R. went to work for the YMCA at the Marine Training Base at Parris Island, South Carolina, one of the jobs which the government granted to those opposed by conscience to participating in war. Working here with the military was pivotal in his becoming a crusader for peace.
I'm convinced that the following the New Testament doctrine of love is the answer. And I must say that I learned from military leadership that they didn't like their business as much as people thought they enjoyed their militarism.
One of MR's memorable experiences at Parris Island was watching as 9,000 Marines and 100 officers were assembled for this photograph. MR often reflected what could be done with that many persons committed to waging peace instead of waging war.
And he said to himself at that time, why can't the church turn out peacemakers like the Marines turn out soldiers? And I think he carried that dream with him all through his life.
They were training the men to kill, which in my judgment is the wrong objective for any group of people in the world to organize to kill people they don't know. In that period of time, the military made me believe that the church was responsible, or the churches were responsible for the prevention of wars.
After the war, MR left for the church's headquarters in Elgin, Illinois to become Home Mission Secretary, and he soon wound up as the leading Church of the Brethren advocate for peace, just as World War II was breaking out.
When the Second World War came on, we were not prepared for a war. However, the annual conference decided to appoint one person to be responsible for the development and the activities necessary to go through a war period as a peace church. And that lot fell upon me.
That meant joining with the other peace churches, the Quakers and the Mennonites, to arrange for alternative service for conscientious objectors, in effect convincing the government to recognize the validity of the pacifist position.
We met in a hotel down there in a bedroom, and organized the National Service Board for Religious Objectors. Because General Hershey said he wasn't going to listen to all the different tribes, that we have to unify ourselves into one body, one voice that he talked to.
This historic film shows the headquarters of the National Service Board in Washington, where MR and leaders of the other peace churches came to an agreement for their members to perform alternative civilian public service, but still under the supervision of General Lewis Hershey, the longtime director of the Selective Service System. MR became a key player in holding that agreement together.
The so-called historic peace churches, Brethren, Friends, Mennonites, they shared the peace witness, but they had different attitudes, different theological perspectives. But MR had this gift of reconciliation and of keeping people together, giving them a vision, keeping them working. And it was as a person who could articulate a vision and challenge and inspire and then get people to work together. I think that's what M.R. Zigler could do and did.
It was an enormously ambitious task. Each denomination committed itself to supporting the civilian public service camps and the 12,000 conscientious objectors who were performing all sorts of tasks to serve their country without violating their religious beliefs against war. Things like planting trees, or fighting fires, building public works facilities, even volunteering for starvation experiments to study the effects of malnutrition. Many CPSers came to MR disgruntled.
There were a lot of times that he wasn't sure it was going to work. He had to go to the camps a lot and meet with the men, and of course the men were unhappy a lot of the time because they were back in the mountains or something like that, or in a tree planting situation, which they thought they ought to be in a place where they were doing something worthwhile.
There were very tense moments. Of course, the tensest moments came between the churches and the government, with some real questions about the whole operation of the CPS program. But even tensions, interdenomination, interagency, and so forth, he had the temperament and the skill to keep people working together and overcome this. I would call him a reconciler, a bridge builder. That's really what he could do. I don't think of anyone at that time, whatever their gifts were, and they were many, who really had quite the temperament and the personality to pull that off.
But it was successful, and the concept of alternative service for COs has been accepted ever since. After World War II, M.R. Zigler headed the response of Brethren to the devastation in Europe. The Brethren Service Commission, which he chaired, sent tons of relief supplies to Europe: food, clothing, even animals. Brethren farmers donated chickens and cattle to those in Europe suffering from the war as a way of sharing the love of Christ with those in need.
He understood the activity of Brethren service in Europe, perhaps you could say in two ways. One is to bind up the wounds of war. And he would very often speak about the fact that here were Americans serving people who just a few short years ago they were trying to kill, so to speak. That is, Americans had been at war with Germans and vice versa, and now you had representatives from those two groups working hand in hand. And so he talked about Brethren service activity as a peace-making, wound-binding sort of effect. At the same time, he would see this as working to do away with the possibility of future wars. So on the one hand, you were helping to restore relationships broken by the agonies and the violence of war. At the same time, you were working to create a more peaceful world. So he definitely saw Brethren service work as just peace in action.
I remember in Elgin he was speaking of 20,000 Brethren young people in Europe by such and such a time. And other people would try to pull him down a little bit, not set his sights so high.
But M.R. was a dreamer, and he convinced many young men and women to join Brethren service overseas.
He would meet them in work camps, he would meet them in programs, and sometimes they would respond to one of his public addresses, or maybe it was just a very personal thing, casual thing. But he had that persistence, and apparently there's something about the integrity of his personality that was impressive and made its impact upon these young people.
It was get out and visit with the people and put his arms around them, and particularly to young people, and say, I think you'd be just a fellow to go to Germany. We got just a job over here at such and such a hospital, would like for you to go there, and so forth. He managed people's lives in this manner, always trying to enlarge their ideas of what they could do.
M.R. had a tremendous ability, I think, to sense where you could make a contribution when a lot of other people couldn't see it.
One thing that M.R. and these others did with the volunteers was remarkable. That is, not to think of them as being young and therefore inexperienced and probably not such capable persons who were 19, 20, and 21 years old, but think of them as having potential for leadership.
Ken Kreider, now a college professor, was a Brethren service worker in Europe.
I remember when I would knock on doors of people to visit with them, and they would learn that I was from America, that I was there because of Heifer Project. They would look around the corner trying to find my father, the quite visible assumption. They don't turn kids like this loose by themselves, but we did, or M.R. did.
He also was so good at taking people who maybe obviously had some ability, but weren't really in positions of leadership, and giving them leadership. And he was always so proud of the fact that Brethren volunteers in Europe were often just solid young people, often not highly trained, not highly skilled, and they just did miraculous things. And M.R. would sometimes laugh and say, they did something because they were too dumb to know they couldn't do it. And that just, those kinds of things just delighted him, to take a person and to stretch him or her and really see them grow. And that's why he was probably most loved.
And M.R. Zigler spawned this idea of kind of reckless faith, where you go in and you create opportunities.
MR appreciated volunteers who shared his Lone Ranger style of operation. Clyde Carter remembers one of MR's visits to a gathering of the Brethren service workers in Europe.
He had come in from Geneva, Switzerland, and he was very serious, and he said, "You all are causing us a lot of concern. You do things that we don't know what you're going to do. You go out and you start different projects, and we don't know what you're starting, and we don't know what you're going to do. You don't ask permission to do these things. You travel to places that we don't give you permission to travel to, and you go and meet and talk with people without asking us permission to do it. And you just seem to be doing so much stuff on your own. And if you weren't that kind of person, we wouldn't want you here."
Well, we just picked up things that need to be done and operated. And the volunteers, the young people, it's amazing what the young people have been able to do. When you put a young person, instead of putting him in the Army, put him to some good work.
Brethren service work was extended to China, where a special 50-man tractor unit helped teach the Chinese to operate tractors, which were provided by a United Nations agency. As he did in other locations, MR visited this project and encouraged the staff. Today, the fruits of Brethren service work continue. Heifer Project International, begun as a Brethren service project in Spain by Dan West, now is an independent organization sending animals all over the world from its headquarters in Little Rock, Arkansas. Brethren service relief efforts were combined with those of other denominations to form CROP, Church Rural Overseas Program. And a sanatorium begun by Brethren service workers in Austria to battle tuberculosis in refugee camps is still in operation.
If you go there today, this is now the recognized tubercular hospital for all of Austria, and it was started by a few Brethren service workers in scrounging these goods here and there, and it became a model hospital. And so there were very sophisticated things that were done. It started with you could say the relief, the soap, the clothing, the food, the blankets, and so on. But that was just to meet the immediate need, and then Brethren service got into things such as vocational training, language courses, student exchange. Then the Heifer Project came in, and there's just a whole variety of things that developed out of those early emergency years.
Peace was the bottom line of the whole business. Heifers for peace, crop for peace, everything for peace. Student exchange, refugees, all peace. And we tried to develop the idea that our projects would all be doing something for life.
In the midst of the Brethren service work, MR was appointed the Church of the Brethren representative to the World Council of Churches as it was being formed. His new headquarters was Geneva, Switzerland, and his compulsion for preaching peace shifted to the ecumenical community. It was here that he argued the point that he is best remembered for, reprinted on a poster, a modest proposal for peace. Let the Christians of the world agree that they will not kill each other.
We must come to the place where American Christians won't kill European Christians and vice versa. And it's that question, how can a Christian kill a Christian, is a fundamental question, in my mind, for our day.
He used that in addresses, he used it in conversations, and he used it to great advantage in the World Council of Churches.
He would go and say to Lutherans that if Lutherans had just refused to kill other Lutherans, there could have been no World War I, no World War II. He said the same thing to the Catholics. He once had an audience with the Pope, and he asked the Pope, why are Catholics killing other Catholics? And the Pope said to him, rather sadly, that unfortunately, when it came to war, the members of the church were citizens first before they were Christians or before they were Catholics. But that was his challenge, his rallying cry.
He also proposed it to the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches as a formal motion, but it failed for lack of a second. As well known as M.R. Zigler was for programs promoting peace, he was also well known for often establishing them first and getting formal permission later.
He said, I got this many, several $1,000s, I don't remember what it was, pledged to build a peace house in Kassel, Germany. I've learned from the Army, they'll send their bulldozers over and they'll help us. And you say, Bob, where's that in the budget? He said, I don't know, but if it's not there, it ought to be, see?
He would get a vision and a dream, and how many of those he had that were good. And he would then, he would kind of, I would say, field test that. He would go around to the people that he knew trusted him and believed in him, and he'd ask how much money they'd give to it. And you know, once you've got a dream and you've got the money to back it, it's really hard to say no to it.
He knew the wealthy people in the Church of the Brethren, and he had a way of going and talking to them and putting his arm around them, and he would get thousands of dollars out of one person.
His commitment to peace was contagious, and he was often particularly effective on a one-on-one basis. As a speaker, he was unpredictable. His speeches either thrilled or flopped.
And I remember as a boy at conference, times when he'd get up and talk about something, but he wasn't on, and it was awful. But other times when he was on, you wanted to get right out of the seat and go join his army and do what he said.
He'd just get up and talk off the cuff, it would seem, when he would speak to a group of people.
Whenever he wrote out a speech, it was awful. And I think that's true. When he spoke to groups, he captured them. And if I would ask him before what he's going to talk about, he'd say, I don't know until I see him.
Yeah, I was never cut out for public speaking. And never dreamed I would be. Never wanted to be. And yet, I found out if I didn't get at it and declare myself, I didn't get very far. And therefore, I just talked about the things that are happening. But the peace issue is the heart of the whole thing. Everything promoting peace. Feeding the hungry, that's Christ's famous idea was hungry and you fed me and so forth, is a criteria. And it's life. And so if you have a beginning of a speech and an end of one, you can fill in between.
M.R.'s speaking was persuasive without being judgmental.
He was convicted on his principles. And yet he didn't say, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. He just said, this is the way I believe.
There was always a twinkle in the eye. I mean, there was nothing that you could consider hateful or sarcastic or negative. He would, in a sense, tell you to shape up, but he would do it in such a way that you knew that he had your best interests at heart.
As M.R. reached the end of his work in Europe, he retired at age 73 to Sebring, Florida, but quickly became restless with the retirement community there.
He was chaplain, and he'd have to go to the nursing home and things like that, and he got so that he just couldn't stand that anymore. These people were dying, and that's all they were doing was dying, and he said that wasn't for him.
So he moved to New Windsor, Maryland, to the Brethren Service Center that he had been instrumental in purchasing for the church back in the 40s, a facility that had become a major center for the kinds of relief work that he himself had helped organize: processing of clothing for relief, refugee resettlement, a warehouse for emergency medical supplies, and the headquarters of the SERVE program, which provides markets for crafts from third world countries. Once here, he longed for a way to teach peace to his favorite audience, young people, and to transfer his fundamental message to a new generation.
I wish every member of the Church of Brethren, and all Christians as far as that's concerned, that they could commit themselves not to kill.
After raising $30,000, he formed the Honor Peace Assembly, which sponsors programs on peace and operates the World Peace Academy for youth. His dream was that every youth in the Church of the Brethren would come here as a regular part of his or her Brethren education, and through it that the peace witness of the Church of the Brethren would be preserved.
On Earth Peace and the Peace Academy, I believe will in large measure transfer what he tried to do, and we, as a part of our program, make a great effort to educate our kids about M.R. Zigler.
Since the Peace Academy was begun in 1979, more than 1,000 young people have participated in the training, and through it have learned about this man named M.R. Zigler and his devotion to peace. M.R. died in October 1985, still committed to peacemaking, to the church, and to the hope that the next generation would continue his work for peace.
When you're in something like that, it becomes a part of you, and you don't see the end.
Stories of M.R. Zigler will echo for years to come. Stories of his dedication to peace, his commitment to the church, and his love for people.
I remember him coming to our house one time. He probably wanted money from Daddy. But what I remember is him sitting across the table and talking to my parents, but we kids were around the table too, and there were some marbles for some reason, and he kept shooting the marbles to us kids back and forth across the table while he talked to our parents. And I think that was typical in that he always had an interest in people, all kinds of people, not just the important people.
It seemed like he had a knack of being able to take people as persons and kind of forget about their influence and their degrees and their position.
He was just down to earth, M.R. Zigler from Broadway, Virginia, and he knew who he was, and he was comfortable with that.